Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, which is a continuation of our Selecting a Methodology and Research Design session. So today we're having session 3 or part 3, where we're going to be looking at the last part, which is data analysis. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we can start with the presentation for the day. All right, so we've spoken about choosing your research design, how you go about collecting your data, and when you've done collecting your data, what is it that you do with that data? How do you make meaning of that data? How do you use that data to answer your research question? And that's what we're going to spend today looking at. Okay, I apologize for that. My screen seems to be freezing. I'm not sure why. Okay, I'm going to start again and try to share again. And then hopefully this time it will work. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure what's happening. I apologize for this. Okay. I'm not sure why my screen is refusing to work. It was working earlier. I do apologize. So just give me a minute. I'm going to try and get it sorted out. Something very strange happening. Okay. I think it's working now. And hopefully it will stay working. I do apologize for that bumpy start. But we are, as I've indicated today, going to be looking at data analysis. And we are going to be briefly looking at a number of data analysis methods.
Sorry, Prof, can you please share again?
I'm told my slides are not showing. Okay. Let me go back. Okay, let's try. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as I was saying, data analysis, that's what we're going to be looking at today. And we have a number of data analysis methods that we're going to be briefly going to be looking at. And I'm saying briefly here because these data analysis methods, if we were to go in depth on all of them, they would each require a session, if you will. But the idea is to give you an idea of the number of methods that are available, or the types of data analysis methods that are available, so that you can then start thinking about which data analysis method might be potentially applicable to your own research, or if you've been trying to look at a number of methods but undecided on which one would be relevant. Hopefully with tonight's engagement and conversation, you'll get some clarity on these various data analysis methods. There's quite a number of them, and you'll see as we go through them that there's also some overlaps as well between the different methods of data analysis in qualitative research methodologies. And this is because it remains an ongoing debate, or it remains ongoing work where, as researchers such as yourself, you're trying to look at what are some of the useful ways in which we can make sense of the data that we get from the research that we've conducted, right? So we've got thematic analysis, we've got content analysis, and I've put them together here because there are some commonalities between them, but also, of course, differences as well, as we will engage. And then we've got grounded theory analysis. We spoke about grounded theory as a research method in itself, and also using it as a way to come up with a particular theory. It is a type of method that we use when there hasn't been much or anything done on a particular topic or a particular area or a particular issue. And so you're developing theory from the ground, if you will. So with grounded theory, even when it comes to analysis, we spoke about how analysis is an ongoing process. And it's very specific when it comes to grounded theory, because from the beginning of the research data analysis itself, you start analyzing. Unlike with other data analysis methods where the analysis come much later, even though you start thinking, you start putting things together, you start reflecting, with grounded theory, it's very, very deliberate. Okay, and we'll touch on that a little bit right now. And then we've got narrative analysis, we've got discourse analysis, and I've put in a number of scholars or researchers whose work you can look into. If you're interested in narrative analysis, you can look into Riesman's work, Plummer's work, Liebler's work. There are many other narrative analysis theories or researchers that you could also look at as well. So they come up with ways in which you can think about the data and analyze your data. And then we also have discourse analysis. And there are some theories that one could think about there when doing discourse analysis. And then interpretative phenomenological analysis, also called IPA. Okay. Okay. I apologize today, my laptop is not cooperating as I would like it to. But let's start with content and thematic analysis. So content analysis and thematic analysis are both qualitative research methods used to analyze textual data. Okay, however, they differ in their approach and their focus. And you'll see content analysis can be used both in qualitative and quantitative research methods, mostly in thinking about how one can use text in a way that can be counted, where you look at the frequency, where you look at how many times do specific words come up. So you're looking at the concepts, the particular concepts, and how these concepts are used, or how frequent these concepts come up or come through. And this would be in analyzing a particular text. Okay, and it aims to provide a comprehensive and objective understanding of the content that you're looking at. Whereas on the other hand, thematic analysis focuses or is interested in analyzing and identifying themes that come up as you look at the data, as you engage the data. What are the patterns of meaning within a particular text, right? And this is one of the data analysis methods that is often used by many students, many scholars, because often you're interested in experiences, you're interested in the meaning that people make of their lives, of the phenomena, and therefore you look at what are the themes that then start emanating from this. It involves a more interpretative and subjective approach, and you'll see in that sense there's also some commonalities or linkages with IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis. So what is the particular phenomena? When you're looking at IPA, you'll be looking at a particular phenomenon, interpreting that phenomena in that particular context. Whereas with thematic analysis is more broad, lived experiences, people's histories, how they make meaning of life. And you'll see those connections also when it comes to narrative analysis as well. Okay, so you're interested in uncovering the underlying meanings and interpretations that is there in the data. So data is not neutral or innocent. It provides you with how people interpret the world, how people make meaning of the world, and how you as the researcher also make interpretations of what you see in front of you. So it has that subjective element to it. While content analysis is more structured and tends to be quantitative in nature, thematic analysis, on the other hand, is more flexible and wholly qualitative. Okay. So here's another way, again, in which we can make comparisons between thematic and content analysis. So looking at the definition, how we define content analysis is mostly from a quantitative perspective, because most of the time it would be used within a quantitative study. However, I thought it's very important for us to mention it here and to engage it here, because it's also applicable and relevant for qualitative studies as well. And depending on your particular discipline, if you are maybe in political science, if you are in history, so there are some disciplines also where content analysis would make sense. When you're looking at the historical texts, when you're looking at archival material, when you're looking at speeches, you would be looking at the actual content itself and trying to make meaning of that content and analyzing that content, right? And how you would then zoom in and make that analysis would be determined by whether you're coming in from a quantitative perspective or you're coming in from a qualitative perspective. Right. And I've already then indicated in terms of thematic analysis that you're interested in the patterns, you're interested in interpreting themes, and you would often be working with a smaller sample. You've got 10 people, you've got 15 people. And so there's a lot of text and data that you're working with that you want to get the underlying meaning of that data. Whereas with content analysis, you have the opportunity to work with a larger body of data, because there you're not doing the kind of intricate analysis in terms of the patterns and underlying meaning that you would do when you are working with thematic analysis. Okay. And because of the subjective nature of thematic analysis, you're not interested in making generalizations. So if you're going to be interviewing 5 people, for example, of course, you're not going to make generalizations, but you're going to offer as an indication of the ways in which people make sense or meaning of their lived experiences, their histories, the phenomena, something that they've encountered, something that they've gone through. And through that, we can get a better understanding of that particular phenomena. Okay. Right. And so looking at the types of content analysis, I've already indicated that it can be quantitative and it can be qualitative. And then how do we then differentiate in terms of doing the actual analysis when working with the data? So with the quantitative content analysis, you develop the themes based on how many times relevant information occur in the data. So it's about the frequency, the actual numbers, right? So you're looking at the frequency of a particular concept, and what therefore that means in terms of making interpretation or meaning of that phenomena from a quantitative perspective, right? Whereas with the qualitative content analysis, you're looking at developing themes that capture the underlying meanings of data portions. And if you heard me just now talking about thematic analysis, you can see already there are some similarities. So again, it's important to really pay attention to the nuances when you are making the analysis, because you don't want to run the risk where the examiner comes back and says, but you're saying this is content analysis, but it reads more, or it looks like it's thematic analysis. Or you said this is thematic analysis, but it reads more like a content analysis, because you're really just providing us with details on what you found in the research that you did, but you did not really go deep in looking at the underlying meanings of the phenomena, right? So you identify the relevant data in a qualitative study, and then you code by examining the text, including the context and the background. And then you generate the themes to represent those underlying meanings. And then you use these themes to address the research question. And this becomes credible, therefore, but it's always bound by the context wherein the study was conducted. So if you did your study in a particular region, a particular province, a particular area, we know that you cannot just then generalize to other areas as well. So it's very context bound, right? And when you look at how content analysis is being defined, as I indicated later, please keep that in mind when we also look at other types of data analysis, to look at these commonalities and look at what makes sense for your own research. I think examples help. Examples assist us to make sense of things, because sometimes when we explain, when we talk about things, when you can't really imagine what that looks like for, or in a research study itself, sometimes it's difficult to articulate. So here's an example of content analysis. Looking at it from a quantitative content analysis perspective, you're interested in doing research on the importance of employment issues in political campaigns, right? You could analyze, therefore, campaign speeches. So you look at the different speeches of different political parties, political party leaders, and then we know many of the political parties, when they're campaigning, they will talk about some of the pressing issues that are there in society. I think those of you who are in political sciences will know, but even those of us who are not, because then we get bombarded by these in the manifestos and the speeches that political parties make. So when you're looking at it from this quantitative perspective, you would then take political speeches and say, okay, how many times the frequency of unemployment, of the word concept unemployment in a particular speech, right? So we just had elections in South Africa recently, and we know that we have many political parties in South Africa. So if you were to take the campaign speeches of the different parties, of the ANC, of the DA, of the EFF, of the MK, of the Freedom Front, of Patriotic Alliance, so all these many political parties, and then you look at the speeches and then you say, okay, from these 20 speeches that I've decided to focus on, how many times does the word unemployment comes through, right? Then you say, okay, in this political party's speech, unemployment appears 20 times. In this one, it appears 15 times. In this one, and so on and so forth, right? And then you start comparing across when we've looked at the frequencies. How many times do jobs appear, right? So promising people jobs, making sure that we reduce unemployment. And then how many times does the word work We're going to create work opportunities. How many of them say that, right? And then you use a statistical analysis tool to then be able to assist you to be able to analyze, right? To find the differences depending on what it is that you're looking at, what your hypothesis is. If maybe you're saying there seems to be an increase in how political leaders or parties are now focusing on unemployment. If we look at the previous 2 elections, unemployment appeared 7 times in so-and-so speech. But now, 10 years later, 2 elections later, unemployment appears maybe 15 times. So what does that tell us about unemployment as an issue, as something that's important, as something that needs to be given attention, and what is it that might have happened or could have happened that has led to now this being at the core of what political leaders are looking at, right? So the number of times, the frequency can kind of give you an idea for you to start making an interpretation or an analysis from a quantitative perspective, right? 10 years ago, it appeared 7 times. Now it appears 20 times. What does that tell us, right? Then you do the analysis. From a qualitative perspective, you also looking at the same phenomena, but differently, right? So you don't have this hypothesis, you have a research question. There's something that you're interested in that you want to answer. So you want to gain qualitative understanding of employment issues. So you see even how the focus would be different. So you're not analyzing campaign speeches as being at the forefront. You're looking at the different concepts that link to or speak to issues around productivity or the economy. So unemployment, jobs, work, all of those are linked into what umbrella? They're linked to the economy of the country, for example, right? Within the qualitative focus of it, you could locate the word unemployment in the speeches, and then you identify what other words or phrases appear next to it, right? So you're not just counting, but you're saying, what is it that they are saying about unemployment? So this speech is talking about how unemployment is as a result, the high unemployment is as a result of the inequalities that are there in society. And so as a party, we're going to make sure that we reduce inequalities by creating job opportunities. Or unemployment is bad for the economy because then it means there are too many people who are not productive citizens. So if we want to boost the economy, we need to deal with the challenge of unemployment, for example, right? So this is the sentence or the phrase that is there in the campaign speech. What do they say? We have high unemployment rates because people are lazy to start their own businesses, or people are just sitting with their arms and they want to be given things. So what is it that the campaign speech is saying and then promising? And then based on what they're saying, what is it that appears next to unemployment? And then based on that, you can then be able to provide an analysis of this content that you have in front of you, okay? You analyze the meanings of these relationships. What is the relationship between unemployment and economy? What is the relationship between unemployment and inequality? What is the relationship between unemployment and laziness? So you look at that, at those words, that content specifically, so that you can better understand the intentions and the targets of different campaigns, right? So what is it that this campaign is saying to us? And then you work with that to then provide an analysis so that we can get a better understanding of the purpose of that particular campaign or the different campaigns that are in front of us. Okay, so that is content analysis in a nutshell. I hope it's making sense to you. And as always, we can always chat more later when we have the opportunity for Q&A. Okay, And then we have grounded theory analysis. So we spoke about grounded theory. And so how does one analyze the data that has been collected from the ground up? How does one analyze the data that was not necessarily driven by a particular theory? So you did not use a particular lens to drive the work that you're doing. There isn't enough literature. That's why you're wanting to come up with this theory and give attention to this phenomenon, because there isn't a theory that really speaks to it, and you want to provide that contribution as a researcher. So what you then do, you start analyzing immediately when you start with your research, right? So it's a very deliberate process of saying, even from the very first interview that you're going to conduct, you start already analyzing. And so your next interview is very much informed and determined by the first interview. So you keep building onto something, right? You build up onto something. So you start with what we call open coding, which is the process of breaking down. So you've got this transcript or two transcripts, and then you're saying, okay, what is it that I'm already starting to hear from this data? What is it that I'm seeing from this data? You break it down, you start examining what is it that's coming through, and then you start comparing, right? You compare from what the person has said in the beginning throughout the interview. If you're looking at the two or three transcripts, you start looking across these different transcripts, and you start conceptualizing, right? And then categorizing the data, saying, okay, how do I categorize? So this is what's coming up, this is what's coming up, this is what's coming up. I'm seeing some similarities here and here. And so I'm going to categorize and start putting this, bundling these together. Okay, and so when you start doing that, that's when you start making sense of that data. And then the next step following open coding is axial coding. And axial coding is a set of procedures whereby the data is put back together. So you've just put everything apart, you break it down, you want to check what it is that starts coming through. And then when you're done with that, you put it together in new ways, right? So it's not going to look like the initial transcript that you had before. So you put it together to start building a narrative, start coming up with an initial theory. So saying to yourself, what is it that this is telling me about this phenomenon? So what concepts are coming through for me, or a concept that's coming through for me? And what is it that is baking this up? So you start putting it together, and is it coming together? Is it making sense? So you make connections between the different categories. Okay. And then selective coding is the procedure of selecting the core category. So what is the core category that's coming up for you? And this is very critical, because this is where now the theory starts being built up, if you will. So the central issue, the central storyline. And so you systematically relate this to the different categories. Are all these different categories all coming together to provide support for this central issue that you now have? So you validate these relationships, you feel these categories, and then you then start looking at saying, okay, what is it that's still missing? What is it that's still needed? And so when you go for further interviews, more interviews, you are building on what you have already found, right? So you keep building on it. So that's why then the interviews would be very much unstructured. A lot of probing. It will be led and directed by the ones that you've already conducted and started making analysis on, and then you build on those to then continue with other interviews. And then from that, you check whether what you're finding still speaks to that central issue or that storyline. At the end of it all, that storyline is going to be your theory, Okay, it's going to be the theory that you then come up with. So when they say Sekhalo's theory of this and that, that's what they would be talking about, because the concept that you would have come up with, or the theory that you would have come up with, is what we would then draw from and use later on in our own research as well. So I hope that makes sense. And then we move on to narrative analysis. And the definition really is in the name itself. So you're interested in the narrative, in what the teller is sharing with you, what story they're telling you, and you're looking at analyzing that narrative. So where does the story begin? Where does the story end? How does the person tell the story? And it goes just beyond the telling in terms of words, but it also goes with the performance of the story, how the story is told, how the story is constructed. Right? So all these different layers would form part of your analysis. And so here, thematic analysis can also then incorporate narrative analysis. With thematic analysis, you are focusing on what is said and not how it is said. So what is it that this participant is saying to you, right? So you're not just looking at the how of it, but you are focusing particularly on what the actual content of the story itself. And from that content of the story, then you start analyzing the text. And then we've got structural analysis. And this still links to narrative, right? And think of narrative as a story. Think of narrative as a plot. So how is the person, or how is the story structured, right? So an emphasis is on the way the story is related, how the story is told. So the issues of content do not disappear, right? So we spoke about the importance of content in thematic analysis, what is being said. But here the emphasis is also on the use of the narrative mechanisms. How is this person telling the story, right? So am I persuaded by their story, right? It's because the how also increases the persuasiveness of the story. So how they structure their story, do they start in the beginning? Do they start at the end and then move back to the beginning? Do they start in the middle and then go back to the beginning and then go to the end? So this back and forth movement. So the structure of the story is also very important. So obviously here as a researcher, you need to be able to see these nuances, right? How is the person telling their story? So if you are, for example, interested in someone's life story, if you're interested in oral history, this is how, or this is the kind of analysis that one would imagine one would use, narrative analysis, because you are listening to the narrative of someone's story. You're listening to the narrative of a particular history. You are listening to the narrative of a particular experience, right? So the structure of how then the story is told becomes the core for you as the researcher in terms of how you're going to focus your analysis. And this has to come through very clearly in how you explain your analysis process, your analysis procedure to your reader, so that when I read your analysis, I should not be confused whether this is a thematic analysis or a structural analysis. And I'll only be able to see that in how you analyze the data, right? What you draw from the data and then make meaning of it. So even with the excerpts that you're going to be using, the extracts that you're going to take, you're going to be explaining to me as your reader that the participant started in the beginning already with the loss of their child. For example, if maybe you're talking about experiences of losing a child. So they don't talk about, this was my child born whenever, I gave birth to this child at this particular moment in time. So they start, where does the story begin? And what does that mean in terms of what's important to the storyteller? Because what's important to the storyteller is what they will most probably choose to focus on or to begin their story at, right? So how they tell their story then becomes important, that structure. And then the interactional analysis, and here the emphasis is on the dialogue. I think the name also just tells us, so there's interaction here. So the dialogue between the teller of the story and you as the researcher, as the interviewer, as the listener. So there's that dialogue in terms of the co-construction or the construction of meaning of what is being said. So here you almost insert yourself in the story, if you will. So again, though, the content and the form, which is the structure, are important. In addition to that, there's also you as part of the story. So you're not just the passive listener, but you're also part of the story. So you also then engage with that in terms of how the co-construction happens in the moment of analysis, how the co-construction happens in the way in which you also conducted the data. How did you co-construct the data or the narrative with the participant? Okay. And then we've got performative analysis. And then performative analysis emphasizes on the performance, right? So it explores the use of words. It explores the use of gestures. I remember in our last session, someone was asking about doing face-to-face or doing an interview or an online interview. So again, depending on what your focus is, the focus of your study, your research question is what you're interested in as the researcher, that will again determine the kind of analysis that you will then going to use. So if you're interested in performative analysis, then chances are you would not opt for interview over the phone, right? So all these different steps are interconnected from the very design that you choose for your research. And the method that you use for your research, all of those things are going to lead you to how you're going to do your analysis at the end of the day. Okay, so this, for those who are in the arts and theater and performance, the analysis includes an examination of the response of the audience as well to the narrative. So if maybe, for example, you're embarking on some ethnographic form of study and you're watching performances, you are observing, or you might even be participating. So how the particular performances happen, you're looking at the different aspects of the performance, the gestures, right? How people use their words, how they use their bodies, and how the audience respond to the performance. So all of those things would form part of the analysis. Okay, so that's the different ways in which one could think about narrative analysis. And then the actual different steps on how you would analyze would then be dependent on which narrative analysis you would be using. Is it structural? Is it performative? So that would then be determined by that. Okay. And then we move on to discourse analysis. So discourse is verbal or written communication between people, and it goes beyond a single sentence. So there's actually an engagement, a conversation, a dialogue of sorts. And the discourse goes beyond language, right? So it goes beyond just the text. And it looks at the overall meanings conveyed by language in context. How is the language used in context? And context here does not mean context in terms of geographical context, but the context in terms of the historical context, the historical moment, the social context wherein the engagement, the phenomena that is being investigated or engaged or given attention to happened. So the social context, the cultural context, the political context, and the historical background of this discourse. So you're looking at the political moment that we're finding ourselves in, for example, right now, and then wanting to say within this particular moment, how do people make meaning of some of the legislations that we have? What does that mean for how people make meaning of their lives, go around and engage in the possibility of social justice, for example? And we also take into account and understand underlying meanings expressed through language. So the idea with discourse is that language is not neutral. So even as you are watching television, even as you are participating and engaging in social media, even as you are listening to the news, there is mediation in terms of how language is used, right? So, and it's important that if you're doing a discourse analysis, that you understand that language is not neutral, and therefore you need to understand language or the meaning of what is being said based on the context we're in or within which it is being used, right? So you could do a discourse analysis looking at newspapers. So newspapers over a particular period of time, and you look at what they say, or now even the social media, because the social media is very powerful. And so you can do your study focusing on how people engage or focus on a particular issue on Facebook or on X or on Instagram. And then you do an analysis of how language or the text that is being used actually mean other things in terms of the cultural implications of what is being said. So within a particular cultural context, how things are perceived, received, understood might be different from how the same content could be understood in another cultural context, for example. So what are some of the things that even lead to the wars that we have right now in the world? What are the implications of that in terms of how one looks at the history? What are the implications of that when one looks at the political underpinnings of some of the wars that we have? Are some of these things just innocent in terms of what the focus is, or is there an opportunity for us to look at what the underlying meanings and implications are that have led to so much bloodshed that we have in the world? So you use language presented in a body of data, right? So you would have analyzed data online, for example, or you would have interviewed people, or you would have done a focus group, and then you look at the language that is being presented in that data to draw meaning, to say, what does that tell us about how society engages with issues of abortion, for example? What are the nuances? What are some of the cultural implications? What is it that's coming through from how people responded to the questions that they were asked, focusing on whether abortion is good or bad, right? So what is it that they draw from to be able to come up with a judgment in terms of whether deciding something is good or not? Okay, so you analyze at a discursive level in that sense. So, and what makes discourse analysis unique, right, vis-a-vis, for example, thematic analysis, is that it posits that social reality is socially constructed, or that our experience of the world is understood from a subjective standpoint. So discourse analysis goes beyond the literal meaning of words and languages. So people can provide us with narratives of their lives. People can provide us with their lived experiences in the conversations and the interviews that we have with them. And then we say, okay, how do we interpret and make meaning of what people have said about this particular lived experience? Okay, and then you interpret at that level. Discourse analysis forces you to go beyond that and say, we are hearing what the person is saying, right? These are the words that they're using. And then based on these words, though, what is it that we can deduce, right, from what people are saying? So you go just beyond the words. Okay. So again, some examples in terms of how you can imagine this in practice, right? You may want to consider discourse analysis if perhaps what you are researching is focusing on issues of power, or you're interested in issues of inequality, right? So if you're interested, for example, in doing research on how affluent individuals interact with those who are less wealthy in the world. So obviously there is some level of inequality, right? There is some level of power with those who have more power than the others. And what does that mean in terms of access to particular resources, to particular spaces that others cannot? So you analyze from those various levels. So if you're interested in issues of power or inequality, then discourse analysis might make sense for you. If you're interested in how people communicate in a particular or specific context, such as situational, social situation with their colleagues versus in a board meeting. So if you're just sitting in the tea room and having conversations, how is that different from when you are now sitting in a formal board meeting and engaging with each other in that space? So looking at the nuances in terms of how people even choose their words, the language that they use when they're sitting together, having coffee freely, right? But vis-a-vis how they would if they were in a board meeting. And sometimes in that board meeting, you might be sitting with the very same colleagues, but then there's a shift in terms of how you now engage with each other. And what does that mean, therefore, right, in terms of how we communicate and how context determines the ways in which we communicate? And then issues of ideology and how ideas around beliefs and values are shared using language, like in political speeches. Those who follow the news and issues around politics and the new government that we have right now, we know about the rhetoric, we know about the conversations that have been ongoing around what does it mean to go into coalition or government of national unity with people, for example, that you may not necessarily have the same ideology with. So what does that mean in terms of looking at issues of inequality? Will you understand them the same way? What does that mean when it comes to engaging or speaking to issues of poverty or unemployment? Will you look at it in the same way? In a country such as South Africa, where there's a lot of contestations, let's say, for example, around the issues of land. So when you're thinking critically around these issues as a researcher, as a scholar, what kind of judgments, if you will, or what kind of analysis would you make when it comes to how we understand ideology and how ideology informs the kinds of manifestos or the kinds of speeches that political parties would put forward? And what does that mean if at the end there's a merge in terms of different parties that may not necessarily have the same ideology? So as a researcher, we look beyond just what your everyday person would be looking at if they're looking at the news, for example, if they're engaging with on political debates. And you as a researcher are interested in the nuances, in saying, but what does this fundamentally mean in terms of how we move forward, right? Politically, how we move forward in attending to some of the societal challenges. So as a researcher, and when you do research and when you ask research questions, these are this is the level of depth that one would imagine or expect in terms of how you would approach and engage with your work. And discourse analysis really forces you to go to those depths when you're working with the data, just going beyond what is presented in front of you. Okay, and then also you may consider discourse analysis if you're interested in how communication is used to achieve social goals, such as maintaining a friendship or navigating conflict, right? And again, earlier I've indicated I've indicated how we're living in a moment where there are so many wars around us. There's so much conflict in different parts of the world. And we know in some of the parts there's been attempts at sitting down to resolve matters, to try and navigate the conflict. But we know, even as we're sitting here today, that some of those have not been resolved. So again, how communication is used. So if you're a communication studies student, for example, or a political science student, these are some of the things that could be interesting, right, as possible things to consider and to think about, and say, even when governments came together to try and engage on conflict negotiation, what was the process? What was the forms? What were the forms of communication? How was that done, right? And what are the implications of that? Or how can we then look at that and say, based on this, that is why perhaps we're still finding ourselves where we are, and what are the possible ways in which we can reimagine the processes of communication or the processes of navigating conflict. So what possible contribution can you as a researcher come up with in terms of how we can reimagine communication within conflict situations? How can we navigate issues such as friendship as well? Okay. So discourse analysis, as I've just indicated, can be a powerful tool for addressing social issues as well as power and power imbalances. So if your research aims and objectives are orientated around these issues, then discourse analysis could be a good fit for you. Okay. So moving on now to another type of data analysis, the IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis. Again, here at the core of it, it's about the phenomenon, right? What is the phenomenon under investigation, and how do we make meaning of this phenomenon? And IPA initially and now is an integral part of qualitative research, as part of also analyzing the data, but it cuts across from even how you conduct your research as well as IPA. So it goes from the research method all the way to then drawing from that, even with the analysis. And it was in its initial stages, or when it was developed, it was used mostly in the discipline of psychology. But of course, over time, because when Velech came up with it in 2008, there's been a move and other contributions and going beyond the disciplinary boundary of psychology to its possible uses in other disciplines as well. And with IPA, very straightforward stages or steps that one follows when you have conducted your data. So you start by reading and rereading the interview transcription, and then you identify the themes, and then you structure the analysis and say, okay, now that I've got these themes, how do I structure and put these together? And then you provide and produce a summary table of the themes to make things easier for yourself. And then even as you do this, you say, what are some of the quotations or excerpts from the data itself that are supportive of these themes that I've come up with? And then from there, you construct a cohesive analysis, which will then be your interpretation, your discussion of the results, and then telling us as your reader what is it that has come up out of the research. So this narrative, cohesive narrative, is based on the summary table on stage 4. So all of these lead, one stage leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. Okay. So even when you come up with themes, some might appear as themes, but as you continue with the analysis, you may realize that no, actually this theme does not work, because if I look at the whole data that I have, it does not cut across in ways that are meaningful for us to say it is worthy of being a theme. You need to be able to justify the themes that you come up with. So that chapter where you do your data analysis and then you say, okay, I've identified 4 themes, or I've identified 3 themes, or I've identified 7 themes. These themes are not thumbsucked. You need to be able to convince us as your readers and show us how these themes have come about. And talking about that, we're now moving to thematic data analysis, which is the most commonly used data analysis method in qualitative data analysis. So what do we usually do? We start by working with the data. So you do your interviews and then you sit with the transcriptions, and then you start saying, okay, what is it that am I going to do with all this data? You've done 15 interviews and each transcript is 20 pages long, and now you're sitting with all of this and you're feeling overwhelmed, right? So you need to sit with each one and start looking at what are the particular the codes that are coming up, right? And I know that now we are lucky, unlike for those who did their qualifications in the past, that we can use software packages such as Atlas TI, which can assist you with coding, with identifying some codes. But as the researcher, you still need to make meaning and make sense of those codes. So and one could do both. So you can use the software package to minimize and do that work for you, but you're still going to be having many codes. And so while you're using the software package, also you as the researcher being very actively involved also assists you. And remember, we also spoke about starting and reflecting earlier on the research or on the data that you're collecting, and not wait for the end so that you're not too overwhelmed. So now you've got 20 interviews done, you've got transcripts of about 20, 35 pages each, because maybe you had participants that were very eager and they were participating and they gave you so much to work with, and now you have all this data. What are you going to do with it, right? So you'll find people in their rooms with sticky notes everywhere and coming up with codes and codes and codes. So as you're working with coding, you start from the specific to the broad. So what are the specific codes? What are the specific things that are coming up for you, right? That are already jumping out. And remember, all of these have to be led or be directed by your specific research questions, right? So you need to stay focused on your primary and specific research questions that you want to answer. So that data that you've now collected has to assist you to answer your research questions. As I say here, codes are driven by the questions. Make sure to cover the elements in your conceptual framework. So what is it that you're working with? And then when you've come up with this inductive coding, you ascribe the codes, the codes to the codes. So, and here you're saying, okay, I had 20 participants. How many of these participants, how many of these codes come up or are relevant to these participants? 12 of the 20, 15 of the 20, or is it 12 or only 4 where these codes appear. So clearly it can be a code that can be built into a theme, right? So you ascribe codes to codes, so the pieces of text from the data itself, and you start looking at what codes are emerging, looking across all the different texts. And this is something that, of course, the software package can also do for you. But I would encourage you also to not be solely reliant on the software package, but also be very proactive in the analysis process. Okay. So you work from a number of individual events or occurrences to establish patterns. So as you start working on the codes, on the data, you will see as you go on, you start seeing some patterns, you start seeing some commonalities, you start seeing things that start occurring over and over again. And this is also similar even when you are collecting your data. Remember when we were talking about saturation process or saturation stage? It's when you start interviewing the next person, what you're hearing sounds very much similar to what you've just heard from the previous 1, 2, or 3 people. And then you start seeing that, okay, no new data is coming through. And as a result, there is really no need for me to continue interviewing. Okay. And as we've indicated, you would often start maybe seeing that after the 12th interview or so. So if maybe the first 2, 3 people thinks that's similar, that's okay. But if it continues throughout, and even though they're similar, hence I'm not saying the same, because the ways in which people would speak about the experience, engage and reflect will not be the same, because how the experience influenced or affected them would not necessarily be the same. So that's why you would want to interview a number of people to be able to say how do people give meaning to this particular phenomenon. Okay, so drawing themes, we start from the bottom, and I've just said this, so this is just the summary, that you start with the actual text, the raw data, the transcripts that you have, right? And then after you've put these transcripts down, then you start saying, okay, what are the specific segments? What are the specific codes, the things that are coming up from this data? So now you start creating this building block of codes that you can use, right? And then when you've done that, you then start working with these codes to start developing or establishing the themes. So what are some of the things that you're seeing that cut across the different codes, right? What are the emerging patterns that you see, or the concepts that emerge across the various conversations? So you would find when you're reading that they would say 15 of the 20 participants indicated how this was an issue for them, right? 17 of the 20 participants did not see this as a problem. Then you're like, oh, okay, so 17 people perceived this particular phenomena in this particular way. And if that is the case, then that is a possible theme, because that is something that emerges or that cuts across the different interviews. Okay, so it's the data, and then you establish the codes, and then you come up with the themes. Okay, so the themes is like the key, the last thing that you do, and that's why it's very important to be able to say how I came up with these themes is that I did 1, 2, and 3. So you need to ask yourself, is this a theme, or could this possibly be just a code, right? What is the quality of this theme? What is it that this theme is telling us, right? How is this theme something that can stand alone, that we can say, based on this theme, we can be able to say this part of the people's story tell us about the issue in this particular way, right? what are the boundaries of this theme? What is it that it covers? What is it that it doesn't cover? And so that which it doesn't cover, how do you then build another theme linked to it? Okay. And are there enough data to support this theme? As I said, it cannot be 2 of the 20 participants, right? So that means there isn't enough data for you to say this is a theme. That will then possibly just be a code. Okay. Are the data too diverse or wide-ranging, right? Are there a lot of disagreements? Are there diverse perspectives in terms of how people see the phenomena? That could be an interesting outcome as well, right? Doesn't happen often, but nothing is impossible. So what does that mean when there's a lot of divergence in terms of what's coming out for you? How do you make meaning of that? And the themes, do they connect with each other? Again, here I take you back to the research question, that with the research question or research questions that you have, the particular themes that you're going to come up with are going to be linked to those questions, because through those themes, you're going to be answering your research questions. So do the themes connect with one another as well? It's very important, because if you were to put your themes alongside or next to each other, you need to be able to tell a story. I need to be able to just look at your themes and get a sense of what story you are trying to tell here. So I look at theme 1, theme 2, theme 3, theme 4, and I'm like, oh, okay, so this is what this study is telling us. Before then going and delving deep into how you as the researcher, making meaning of what you found. Start analysis immediately. So don't complete your data analysis and then you sit, you don't do the analysis, and then you only do analysis 6 months later, because you want to still have the data and the process very fresh in your mind for you to be able to work and engage with it. You can involve more than one person. So someone who's going to have a look at your work. You have your supervisor or supervisors, of course, they're going to be looking at your work. But also, again, in terms of member checking, you check with people to also look and say, did I represent you correctly? Are you happy with the way that I've articulated and analyzed your work? Do you have feedback? And also someone else who can read your work. Leave enough time for analysis and writing. So it should not be a rushed work, because it's a critical part of your study, really. So the code book, how does that work, and what is the structure of the code book? And again, with the software packages, we don't worry too much, but it's important to understand the process as well. We always say this for both qualitative and quantitative research. You cannot just leave all the work to a software to do the work for you. You cannot just give it to SPSS or to give it to Atlas TI to do the work for you. So there has to be that code. You need to know what this code is, what is the definition, and then what is the full definition. So what is this code? What does it tell us? And then you expand also to say, okay, with this code, this is what I expect to see, what I expect to find. And I will use this code every time I see this particular word or the particular phrase in the raw data, right? So this is when I will add this as a code. I will add the word or the phrase as a code when I see it this way or that way. And then guidelines on when to use the code, and then examples or excerpts from the text. So you see, going back to the manual doing of it, this is also feeding to, or what informed the actual software system that then said, okay, you actually don't have to do this yourself and labor. You can have a software that assists you to be able to do that, right? So you do the code work development once there's agreement on the codes. And then you look at how you are defining your codes, and then you review, you check, is this a code, is this not a code? And this assists you to manage your data, and it assists you to organize things as well for yourself. But also for the credibility of the study. Remember, we're talking about in qualitative research, the importance of trustworthiness, the importance of credibility of the study. So doing this and going through this process provides you as the researcher with a trail of evidence, so that even if I come and I question you about how you went about coming up with these codes or coming up with these themes, that you can easily just show me the process you followed to come up with these codes. And here's just an example of a code book. So here's the code. The code is margin. So that's the code. So you're looking at your transcripts. There's, as I said, 20 interviews that you've conducted. So you've got 20 transcripts. And in these 20 transcripts, you're saying, okay, the concept margin is very important, is coming through. But how do I define what margin is, or being on the margin is? And then you say, okay, this would refer to marginalized community members. Okay. And then the definition of marginalized community members, how would you see that? How would you know what marginalized community members are when you're looking at the transcription? And this is where a full definition that you provide for yourself, so that if I ask, you can be able to say, this qualifies as a marginalized community member. It includes this, it excludes that, right? And because it's related to my topic, my research question, because I'm interested in those communities in the margins. I'm interested maybe in immigration or migrant communities. So community groups that are negatively perceived as socially or physically outside the larger community structure. So all those who might fall in this category would then be perceived as marginalized community members, and therefore would be perceived as those who are in the margins. So when you see anything that links to this in the transcript, then you know that, okay, this is a code. You use the code every time when there is mention of individuals or group that form part of the larger community that has been marginalized. Okay. So, and people can use different words, but if you know what you are looking for and what the code is, then you would know, even if people are using different words, that they would fall under this particular code, right? So here the examples are outcasts. So people that are, someone is answering your research interview question, and they're talking about these outcasts that what, and already they've used that word, okay, outcast. So outcast would fall under people who are perceived to be in the margin. The extremists, this and that and that. Oh, extremists are often used or seen as people in the margins, and they are perceived negatively, especially in certain parts of the world. Or the radicals, or the people in the peripheral. Or the periphery rather, and people that are perceived as strangers or outsiders, or people who are ostracized, or people that are perceived as bizarre, right? So every time in the transcript where one of these words would come up, then that would form part of the coding, right? So under the coding, under margin, so let's think of this graphically. Under the code margin, you can have these arrows pointing in all different directions. If you're using sticky notes, you can have the sticky note in the middle that is yellow that says margin, and then you've got red ones in the next level that then have these words, outcast, extremists, this and that and that. So these are the codes that you would have. And then from these codes, obviously, you would then start thinking about whether there is a theme that emanates from this, right? And you'll see there at the bottom, it just gives an example of how maybe an interviewee could use these words in a sentence during the interview. Okay. All right. And codes are very specific, right? Like I've said, outcast, periphery. What did we have? Ostracized, bizarre. So very, very specific words, right? And as you can see, it can easily build up to many, many codes. So margin is just one code. And under that code, you've got all these layers. And then you have another code, right? And then under that code, there are these layers. So at the end, when you look at your codes, you might find that, I've got so many codes. These are all important, but then you cannot write about all the codes. And that's why then there's the next layer. The next layer is what? The themes, right? So you cluster the codes together so that you say, okay, if I look at these codes, if someone were to walk in the room and you say to them, look at this, what is it that comes to mind when you look at this? Or if you look at these little sticky notes, and then you come up with one sentence, what would that sentence be, right? So you cluster the codes together to create meaningful units. And from these units, you're creating the themes. So the themes assist you to be able to deal with all this data and then be able to say, okay, how do I make sense of all this data in a way that I can be able to attend to all of them, right? So these categories. So the themes then become the subheadings of your discussion chapter in your thesis or your dissertation. They assist you with the structure of the work that you're doing. So you're saying in my study, so that we're not going to see your codes, right, in your thesis. So when you're writing up, we're not going to see the codes. You can explain the process to us as your reader in terms of how you generated the themes, but you're not going to be telling us about all of that or showing us all these codes. What we are going to be seeing in your final dissertation is the themes. But now we're discussing how you end up having the themes that you have, right? So the codes in each theme gives you a roadmap of the different aspects that you need to cover in the discussion of each theme. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And here's just a quick example. I'm about to stop so that we can have a discussion. And here we have, so the themes, we can have experiences of the tsunami, right? So what is it that falls under experiences of the tsunami? What is it that you're going to be discussing? So it's going to be emanating from the codes, right? And from those codes, you're going to have these aspects that you're going to be discussing. So what are these aspects? Under the experiences of the tsunami, you're looking at how people experience flight for survival. So this is the experience that they had. My experience is that I left the house because I was scared and I escaped to a safe place. Family members were injured. So in my family, we experienced injury, people ending up in hospital, people getting hurt. And we also had to search for missing family members. And we also witnessed a very traumatic scene. So these are all falling under the experiences of the tsunami. So in your discussion, in your chapter, these are the things that you're then going to be focusing on, right? So you're going to be talking about how the participants spoke about the missing family members. So 7 of the 10 participants indicated that they lost their family members, or their family members went missing and they had to look for their family members. And this was a horrible experience for them, where they felt this sense of trauma as a result. And so this is what you would then discuss. So here under category A, B, C, and D, under experiences of the tsunami, you have that theme, and then under that theme, these are the possible things that you would discuss. So you need to know, what do you mean by reactions following tsunami? What do you mean by extent of losses? So if that's a theme, what does that theme mean, right? So what do you mean by extent of loss? So loss of a parent, family, I lost family members, or just one family member, loss of relative. And you can think even replacing experiences, for example, with experiences of the tsunami with experiences of COVID-19. And you'll see some similarities there as well in terms of what are the possible things that could come under how people respond to questions around what were your experiences of COVID-19, or how, rather, the broader question, how were people impacted by COVID-19? Right. And then COVID-19 had a huge impact on people because people lost their loved ones. It caused disruption of family because we could not visit each other because of the lockdown. Schools had to close and now children were at home. You lost your network and support. So can you see those similarities in terms of what can come up? So, and this is what then gives you an idea also in terms of context and the importance of context. So in a particular context of a tsunami, what are the experiences? In a particular context of COVID-19, and you'll find that sometimes, as you see in this case, that there could be some commonalities in terms of the processes. And then when we're talking about, again, research designs, we spoke about visual methodologies. So how does one analyze visuals? And there are different ways here. And with visual methodologies, you also draw from participatory action research. Where with most of the visual methods within qualitative research, you would draw from things like photo voice, for example, using the arts, using performance, and it's often a very collaborative process. And if you're drawing from participatory action research, at the core of it is that your participants are very are active in the actual collection of the data, because they produce the art, because they take the pictures, right? And so the codes and the themes come from the visuals themselves. So you're not going to have this raw data in terms of text, but your text in this sense is visual text, right? So you then engage in conversations or interviews with the participants to give meaning and to analyze the visuals, to analyze the photos. So if people have taken photos, they're not just going to give you the photos and then you're going to look at those photos and then analyze. There has to be some engagement. So through that engagement, there's already a process of analysis that's taking place there, because the person will tell you, no, I took a picture or I made an embroidery, like in this example here, of some of the work that I do, that I made this embroidery here because I wanted to depict the kind of violence that women experience when they go to public health institutions, particularly to give birth, right? So through that, so one cannot just look at that and then deduce this. But that interpretation and collaboration becomes very important. Analysis is ongoing, and it can inspire new questions throughout the research as the research begins to gain insight into, or the researcher rather, apologies for that error, as the researcher begins to gain insight into participants' unique socio-cultural realities. Right. So in our community, in my experience, for those who have to use public health facilities, these are some of the challenges. So you see already we're moving from just the personal experience of having to go into a hospital or a clinic and experiencing this violence, but also linking it to the challenges that are generally there in public health institutions. Okay. I hope that makes sense. And then lastly, as you collect data, as you analyze the data, there's also the process of what we call reflexivity, which is very important. It's something that came particularly in qualitative research in the 1980s as a way to approach interpretation in qualitative research. And some scholars consider it as an ideological approach or orientation, where you bring yourself in as the researcher and you reflect on the process, you reflect on how you're implicated in the study itself as a researcher, Also, depending on the focus of the research that you're doing, do you perceive yourself as an outsider or an insider, or insider outsider? Are you part of that community or not? And so there's been various techniques that scholars have attempted to look at the process of reflexivity, also understanding that when we do this work, we bring ourselves into this work. So we bring our bodies into the work as we come face to face and engage with people, but we also bring our mind into this process as well. And therefore, it's important for us to always reflect as we're doing the work. Sometimes in research, we fail to notice some details because we perceive it to be too minute, right? Like, oh, it's common sense. No, each and every part of the process of the research is very important. And sometimes we miss things because they're too familiar to us, right? So too close to us, or sometimes too removed to us that we cannot relate to it. Therefore, we can't really truly bring ourselves into it. So when you reflect on the process, when you reflect on how something made you feel, uncomfortable, restless, what does that mean for you in the process of research, right? So it forces you or allows you to not just skip over things that can actually be important in the overall research itself. And again, how do you ensure trustworthiness? Reflexivity also assists in this. It's also a way of strengthening the trustworthiness of our analysis and our research. And that brings me to the end of that presentation. And so I'm going to come back to you now, and then we can use the rest of the time that we have together to have a conversation around some of the things that stood out for you. Hello, Belinda. Is it possible to use two different sampling methods? Yes, absolutely. You can use two sampling methods. Again, it depends on what it is that you want to achieve. So that which you want to achieve will determine whether it makes sense for you to use two sampling methods. So maybe you use convenience sampling, but then you also use snowball sampling, right? So it's convenient because maybe it's in a particular area and you've got this unique topic that you're focusing on. It's convenient in terms of the funds that you have, that you can go to a faraway place and therefore you need to do work here. But even if it's convenient, maybe you might not have access to the population that you're interested in, or enough people, but maybe 2 or 3 people. So you can go for a convenient sample and then maybe also at the same time do a snowball sampling as well, as an example. So there are different sampling methods that you can use, and on how you can combine the different sampling methods would be determined again on what it is that you want to achieve. Okay, so is it possible to use two different sampling methods? Absolutely. Okay, Meloguhle, I'm going to ask that maybe you be more specific in the question that you're asking, because you're asking me to expand on these recommended tools for qualitative research analysis. So I'm not sure which tools you're referring to. Are you talking about the analysis methods that I've mentioned? Or what tools are you talking about? So I'm just going to go through the other questions, and in the meantime, you can maybe type in a clarification for me so that I can try and attempt to answer your question. Okay. All right, so a follow-up question from you again, Maloguhle. Can I change sampling at PhD level after completing my master's, or should I continue with what was approved at master's? But Meloguhle, PhD and master's are two standalone qualifications. And so you might have conducted a a study at master's level using a particular sampling frame. And then you find that, okay, at PhD level, you want to use a different sampling frame. So you are more than welcome to do that. Masters and PhD are not married to each other. They are two separate and independent qualifications. So you can definitely change your sampling at PhD level after you've completed your master's using a different sampling focus. So if it's a continuation of your PhD, it depends on what it is that you want to achieve. If you are expanding as well. And it could be a different sample in a sense that maybe your sample includes now younger and older people, and maybe at master's level you were only looking at younger people and now you're including older people as well, or you only looked at women in a particular phenomenon, but now you're interested in also the experiences of men as well, or your experiences of men. So for your PhD now you're focusing on men, while at your master's you were focusing on women. Okay, so the sample can then change in that sense. So it depends on what it is that you're looking at, what your question is, and therefore what would make sense in terms of who your sample can or should be. Okay. So yeah, that's going to be dependent on what it is that you want to focus on. But like, as I said, your master's should not determine your PhD. Some people at their PhD level, they go totally different, a totally different route than what they did for their masters. Some even the actual method itself changes. Some do a qualitative study at master's and then they do a quantitative study at PhD, or they do a quantitative study at PhD, or the other way around, right? Yeah. And so the same with sampling as well. What is it that you found out that maybe you are curious to know whether a different type of sample could provide you? Okay. Anonymous. After interviewing people, can I use AI to summarize the responses? Anonymous, okay, so I'm going to answer you this way. It's very tricky to use AI, hey? So we need to think around issues of ethics and using AI responsibly, and understanding that AI is a tool and therefore not a replacement. So if you use AI to summarize the responses, you might miss out on the nuances of the codes that might have come up, because in this case, then AI determines what the codes are for you. So you still need to apply yourself. And the example I can give here is what I spoke about earlier when I said we are now using Atlas TI, right, to assist us with the coding after we've interviewed people and we have the transcripts, and then we just subject these transcripts to the software package called Atlas TI. There are others, of course. And then through that, what then the system does, which I guess in today's talk, you can say, okay, when we put things under AI, this is what AI does for us. So when you put it into Atlas TI, that's what Atlas TI does for you. So it also assists in the coding. So you can call that summarizing, if you will. It assists in the coding, but you as the researcher still need to work with those codes. So in this case, you don't go looking for the codes per se, because the system has been, or the software has been programmed in such a way that it looks at all the similarities that are there throughout the various transcripts, and then it also checks across the different transcripts as well. And then from there, it then provides you with these codes that you can then work with. You as the researcher, of course, you still have the work and the responsibility of doing the interpretation of the work. And now the question also that I have is, if you do not also become actively involved in the process of checking and working with the system, how would you be able to make an analysis? How would you be able to interpret? I know it's a long-winded answer, but the simple answer is that I would just like to caution and say that one needs to, if possible, attend a workshop or a webinar to understand how to use AI within the spaces that we are finding ourselves in teaching and learning and in research. So as a researcher, it's very important for you to actually do the work and apply yourself. So just simply getting AI to summarize the responses for you would be insufficient. Just simply getting the artificial intelligence to do that for you would not be acceptable in of itself. Okay, and I think just broadly or generally to speak to all of us about the importance of being careful about using AI or how we're using AI is that the university is very, very, very strict. You know, as much as we've been using Turnitin to be able to pick up plagiarism, it's because we see the importance of you owning the work that you're doing, that when you say you've produced the work, that it's actually your work. And we know that in AI, it's not that easy because it does not necessarily copy, right? It doesn't plagiarize in the sense that we understand, or we have come to understand plagiarism as being in terms of just taking chunks and chunks of people's work or words without proper acknowledgement. So AI is a tool that actually generates the information. So it does not steal your information or somebody else's information. It generates it. So in that sense, it's not plagiarism in the way that we've come to understand it. But of course, it's still plagiarism because it's not your work. So you need to be able to still apply yourself and apply your mind as well. Okay. You have access to Atlas TI as a registered UNISA student. Please engage your who would be able to assist. Speak to your supervisor, I think, as the first line of communication, and they might be able to assist you. You requested numerous times from ICT, but no response. Apologies for that. I suggest that maybe you ask intervention of your supervisor, and then maybe also even the M&D office of your department might be able to intervene as well, because I know how it can delay you in doing your work if you're waiting and you cannot proceed to the next phase of your work because you're being delayed by the system, which is making it difficult for you to access the software package for you to do the analysis of your work. Apologies for that, but I would suggest that you contact your supervisor as well and see if maybe they can assist. I'm not sure if my colleagues at CGS also have another way in which students can be assisted to easily get access to Atlas TI. And if there is, I would suggest that they maybe provide that information to all the students on the relevant platform. Okay, all the best with that. I hope you get access to the Atlas TIs. Okay. Okay, Anonymous. You prefer to read from hard copy. In fact, I understand you. You study better reading from paper. Is it possible to access or receive session notes that are printable and I can read from paper than other gadgets? If you're talking about the slides from today's session, yes, they are available, and I know that they are uploaded onto the system. So you're more than welcome to get access to them there, and then you can print them at your leisure and then sit with them and engage. But you'll also note there's a lot of embedded web links as well, and I've put those links there so that you can read further on some of the things that I spoke about today, because there isn't enough time, but because some of the work are also from other published works and online works, I could only provide you with snippets, but I encourage you to also maybe go and read the full body of work, especially on the particular analysis methods that you're interested in, to delve deeper into them and really understand them thoroughly. Okay. So do the themes come from the interview guide? No. Okay. For instance, if I asked 3 broad questions and few other prompting questions, how do you formulate the themes? And is it research objectives that guide you on your themes, especially if you're not using a qualitative data analysis program like Atlas TI? Can one do it manually? How would you verify those are the right themes that you generated? Okay, first of all, even if you use Atlas TI, you cannot verify, because it draws from what you give it. So it draws from the transcripts that you give it. So then what would be generated by the system would be what would have been fed to the system. So it would be the same as what you would have been doing manually. And then generating the themes there. I said your interview questions. Do the themes come from the interview guide? Not necessarily. Your themes come from the actual data itself. Your themes are going to come from what your participants have shared with you. So your interview guide, and here, oh, okay. If you had 3 broad questions, right, and then you had prompting questions, and remember, sometimes some questions are going to be determined by how your participants are answering you. So you might have gone with 5 questions or 7 questions, but at the end you might find that maybe you ended up asking 15 questions, right? So that already goes beyond your interview guide, because when you probe, when someone answers you, and then maybe you want an elaboration, then you ask a follow-up question that would assist you to get a more deeper, in-depth understanding of what your participant is talking about. That already then adds on the questions that you have. How do you formulate the themes? If you remember the slides just before I spoke about reflexivity, I was trying to speak to that. I'm also just looking at the time when you asked the question, and I think I hope that as I got to those slides, your question got answered. The themes come from what your interviewees have told you. So you've got the transcript, right? And then from these transcripts, you're going to read and read and read. And then as you read, you start identifying the codes. Okay, what are the things that keep coming up? What are the things that keep coming up? And what are the relationships between these things? And it's easier when you're working manually, because then you can even draw, you can create networks and show how things are connected, right? And I spoke about sticky notes. You can even do it on the wall as well. And so from there, you start saying, okay, what is it that I'm starting to hear, right? And that is when your themes are coming up. What is it that I'm starting to hear, right? I gave an example of experiences of COVID-19, or how COVID-19 impacted people. So that's your broad research question, the impact of COVID-19 on people's livelihoods, or on people's experiences of trauma, something like that. And then you interview people on these experiences. And then based on what they said, you then start saying, okay, many of these participants are talking about how traumatic the experience was, right? Okay, so there seems to have been experiences of trauma. But how did this trauma manifest? And that's what then you're going to be discussing. So then when you're saying maybe experiences of trauma as a theme, And it because, right, trauma. So this is a code. Trauma is a code. So what about trauma that people were talking about? So you're moving from this code that we call trauma to saying, what is it that's telling us about how people experience COVID? And then from there, you then develop a theme around the discussion of trauma. So you can give it a nice name, theme. So some of them can be quite creative as well. I always encourage my students, even with the themes. Sometimes the themes can be extracted from what your interviewees have said. So someone can say something very beautiful or something very powerful. In the context of what they're telling you, or they can say something that comes across to you as being very catchy, you know. And that was the last time I saw my mother, right? So that could be a theme, because 12 of the 15 participants also spoke about how they lost their mothers, right? And then they speak about the experiences of how that process happened. And then so you can have it as, that's how I lost my mother. Then you can speak about how the loss of the mother affected people, right? And you also then participants to say, as participants so and so indicates, and then you provide us with what they said in the context that's linked to that theme. Okay. So I hope that makes sense to you. How do you verify that the themes are right? You verify based on the transcript. Where do these themes come from? It's the verification process. And that's why some exam, or that's why your supervisor would also want to see your transcripts, because you said, okay, I've come up with these 5 themes. This is what they're about. And so when you give me your transcripts and I look at your transcripts, and then I'm going to say, but I'm not seeing that here. So you're saying that this issue of trauma is a theme. But when I looked at your transcript, I noted that only 3 participants of the 20 mentioned something on trauma. So that does not mean it's not important, but it was only 3 people who spoke about it. So how are you saying, therefore, that that was a major theme? Because remember, a theme says, what is the pattern? What is the thing, the common thread that's starting to appear in the data that I can say, okay, this is what this is telling us about. Okay. What's the importance of including verbal part of what you get from the participant. So what you get from the participant is not only what they say, especially when you're doing face-to-face interviews. It's not only what they say, but it's also in how they're saying it as well. So if at some point a person starts crying, if at some point you can see a person starts getting very sad, or there's long moments of silence, that's also saying something, right? So that's also speech. So non-verbal cues are also important, that as you provide your results, your analysis, you also refer to how emotional some of the participants got, to a point that some of them, or 3 of them, or 5 of them, started crying, right? And this showed how they're still dealing with this, or how they're still experiencing the trauma, or how they seem to not be coping with this, for example, or how talking about this actually was very difficult because it took them back to that place. And they started crying, showing how perhaps the trauma is still ongoing. Right. So the nonverbal cues are very, very important. So that's why it's important for you to take note of them. And that's why immediately after the interview, you also need to keep your own notes as well. So even if you're recording, so that you can pay attention, but it's also important that immediately after the interview, you also note the process. We always say it's only what you're talking about, but it's also the process as well of the engagement with the interviewee. Okay. Okay. So category anonymous is just basically means it's how you categorize things. Where do things fit in, right? So you do the categories under the codes, or you can even do the categories under the themes, and you can have themes which a theme which is the main theme, and then under the main theme you can have a sub-theme. Some students do that. Sometimes it creates a lot of work for you. So 1.1 and then 1.1.1, and then some would even have 1.1.1.1, right? So you can have the subs, but you need to also be able to to have a reason why you're having a sub, right? So you have a theme, which is the main theme. So we can say it's the umbrella overarching theme on a particular point that you're making. And then under that theme, there's also other things that came out, but that are not a major theme, but they are important enough that you would like to add them. Okay. And this is where you, as the researcher, have the freedom to be able to make that decision. It's not a prerequisite or a requirement. So you won't get penalized if you do, you won't get penalized if you don't. So as you're working with the data, you make that determination. You make that determination to say, okay, how do I categorize this particular phenomenon? How do I categorize this particular code? So there's the code, and I categorize under this particular area. I categorize, so it's margin, like I was saying before. And then what would the words or the text or the concept that would be categorized under the code of margin? What would fall under those who are perceived to be in the margin, right? And so when you categorize this, then it's when you make the decision to say, okay, all of these would fall under that category of being people in the margin, but these ones would not fall under that category. Okay, so that's how you categorize things. All right, so I spoke about ostracized people, prostitutes, terrorists, things like that, and say, okay, these are people that society perceives as those that don't belong, as those that have something in them that does not allow for them to be in the mainstream of society, and therefore they're people on the margins. And who would those be? Who would belong in the margins? How would we categorize those who belong in the margins? Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And then when you're done with that, then you then take it a step further to say, okay, all of these people, what story can I tell about what being ostracized, being deemed a terrorist, and all of this and all that, and being in the margin? What do all of these mean? And that's how then you formulate your theme to say, okay, this would be people who experience this kind of life. This would be people who have this kind of exposure in life, and that then becomes your theme, and then saying under this theme, this is what I'm going to be discussing. Okay, I hope that's clear. Okay, I had 23 participants. As I said, the transcripts at the end, you want to complete your PhD. Anonymous. And you soon learned and realized that that is just too much interviews to perform, okay? And especially at master's level, Okay, so data saturation should have been reached. So cut down to 13 participants only. Okay, so that was a relief. Oh, okay. So, okay, you're sharing your experience. Okay, that's good. But you're also indicating that it was a waste of time as the work was done already. Exactly. And thank you for sharing that experience with us. Okay, so Anonymous at 23 participants realized that it was way too much, and this was only for a master's. And at some point, data saturation had already been reached at 13, but then you continue because in your proposal or ethics application, you said you're going to interview 23 participants. So again, please remember, your proposal is exactly that. It's what you're proposing to do, right? You're hoping that you're going to interview so many people. You might end up with less, you might end up with all of them, but you should not keep on going even when you see that, okay, nothing new is coming up anymore. So for Anonymous here, at 13 participants, already saturation was reached. And it takes time, effort, and resources to conduct interviews, because sometimes you have to travel all the way to where your participants are. That's time, that's money in terms of resources. So you also need to think about your research project holistically in terms of what it is that you can do and other things that you can do beyond your master's or your PhD. Please remember, PhD is also not the end. We also have postdoctoral fellowships that are possible for you if maybe you feel that this project you would like to take forward. Okay. So Anonymous, I also think that, yes, it might appear as if it was a waste of time, but also, revisit the data, look at the work and see maybe in what ways you can still use the work beyond the qualification that you're busy with or have attained. Okay, in case of qualitative, hi, Solomon. In case of qualitative, can we use multi-method like focus group, key informant interview? Yes. We actually covered this in our previous session. And if maybe you did not get the chance to attend that session, I would encourage you to go and have a look at the recording and then just hear the discussion that we held on that. But a simple answer to you, absolutely. You can use a combination of different data collection methods. So you can use focus group, key informant interviews. Again, what is the purpose? What is it that you want to achieve, right? The question which is prepared for both is different. Absolutely, yes. So at the end, how can we come to one point for qualitative when our design is mixed method design? Okay. So you again, okay. You must remember that you asked different questions in the interviews themselves, but for your overall study, you still had, or you still have only one or two or three overall overarching interview research questions that are guiding your study, and that's what you need to focus on and to think about. And so you need to be able to then say what data analysis method would best assist me to be able to analyze this data that I have. So you can use one. If you want to make your life a little difficult, you can use two as well. Again, here you can say for focus group discussions, you're going to be using a discourse analysis, and this is why. And to make your life easier, you can even have different chapters where you discuss these results, right? So you have your focus group discussion where you are using discourse analysis as a method of analysis. and then you have your key informant interview or interviews, and then there maybe you're using you're using thematic analysis. So you can use two, or you can say you're going to be using discourse analysis for both, for all of them, right? Because remember, even when it comes to analysis, you're not going to have a lumped up analysis for both for focus group discussion and the key informant interview. You're not going to do that because their focus and what you would have been looking at, and therefore the reason why you did different data collection techniques is because you're looking at different things, right? So because of that, it would make sense for you to then look at them differently. And when you do that, it allows for you to use different data analysis techniques. But as I've indicated, it is possible that the data analysis technique that you choose could be applicable or can be used for both, even though it's going to be applied differently because of the answers that you have gotten and the focus of the work that you've done. So for example, narrative analysis makes more sense if you're doing key informant interviews. Can you see? Okay. Is the theme then based on the majority of the common responses you get? Simple answer, yes. Remember, I said you start looking at the pattern that starts arising. So what is the common thread that is starting to and therefore, yes, the theme would be based on the majority of the common thread. You want to maybe as part of your overall discussion to say that if there was an interesting, the outlier, what we would call the outlier on the other side, if there was an interesting input thing that came from a participant, you are more than welcome to mention that also in your analysis, that one of the participants highlighted or indicated this, right? And if that's something that stood out for you, then you also pay attention to it and then do your own interpretation of it. Okay, but the themes generally it's because the data has spoken in a way that throughout or in most of the responses, this was the common thread. Okay. Benzo, I wish I could do a drawing for you. The codes are the initial analysis process. So you have the data raw as it is, right? Good morning, my name is so-and-so. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me. Tell me this and that and that. And then you go on. So how did you come to the point in your life, this and that and that? So tell me this and that. So that's your raw data, right? It's that 20 pages of your transcript. When you sit with that raw data, you're going to look at what is it that is jumping out from this data. But also that which you're looking at is always, the lens that you're using is always with your research question in mind, right? So what is it that's emanating here? What are the things that are coming out here about how problematic COVID-19 was for the economy, right? So this person spoke about losing jobs, and they spoke about how their marriage got strained as a result because no income was coming in anymore. And then the children now were at home and they were struggling to pay for the fees for the school. So there's already something that's already coming up in this, right? So the code, for example, in this case would be economy, right? So let's say economy. I don't know what your research question would have been, but then you would have been talking about what are some of the struggles, the challenges that people who that people had as a result of COVID-19, right? So economic challenges could be a code, right? And why is it a code? Because people are talking about, so what would economic challenges look like, right? Problems in the marriage as a result of job loss. So job loss, economic challenges. Struggling to pay the children's school fees, economic challenges. Yes, losing a job or losing a house, like many people did, economic challenges, right? So all these points that are coming out all fall under economic challenges, economic challenges. So you're depositing them there. That is the code and then the categories. So all of them under economic challenges. And then you look at other codes as well that will speak to that research question of yours. So economic challenges speak to the struggles that people experience as a result of COVID-19. What other challenges were there? Loss of lives or multiple deaths, something along those lines. So that's a code as well. Why is it a code? Because there are all these other things that are linked to it, right? We could not bury people as a result of lockdown, issues around loss of lives, that appear in the transcript. It's things that you would then pay attention to. Okay, and then when you've done that, then you can come up with themes. So what are the themes around issues on economy that you can talk about? And then when you have that theme, then you can have your discussion under those themes and then support that with the excerpts from the participants. I hope that answered your question, Banzo, to some extent, if not fully. And yours was the last question, and I'm also looking at the time. We are a few minutes over our time for tonight, and so I think we're going to stop here. And this brings us to the last of our 3-part session on selecting a methodology and research design. And I hope that as you're working on that very important chapter, in your thesis or dissertation, that you would have found this useful as you think about how to decide on your methodology and all the different processes and stages of the research methods of your study. Okay, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for our next session. Thank you very much and goodbye, everyone.